First, let's jump straight into Daniel chapter 7. And we're looking at the little horn. And there's various scriptures and words that would talk about the little horn. And very interesting to read about this little horn. And it says, even of that horn, this little horn, that had eyes and a mouth that spake very great things, whose look was more stout than his fellows. So this stout little fellow, this stout little horn, this belligerent, pushy, stubborn, self-exonerating, everything about this little horn, he's more stout than his fellows, more pushy, more belligerent, and unwavering, unchanging, and more dominant than the rest. So he's very, very stout. I beheld, and the same horn made war with the saints. Well, why are we reading all of this? Why are the saints being God's children in the last days? We're reading about the last days because clearly this Antichrist, this little horn, this little stout little man, so to speak, who's more stout than his fellows, more pushy, more belligerent, more determined than any other politician on earth, that he succeeds. So why are we being told about this pushy little man that's going to be more stout than his fellows? Why? Because the saints are going to be here in the last days. Clearly it comes up time and time again that this little horn makes war with the saints. I beheld the same horn made war with the saints and prevailed against them. Now why is it that we're reading all of this? It's because the saints are going to be here. It's God talking to Daniel, and all of this being told to the saints that are going to be here in the last days, not in Daniel's days. Daniel was told eventually to close the books because they wouldn't concern him in his day. It would concern us in our days. So time and time again, it talks about this same little horn coming at it from various different angles. And this stout little man, more stout than his fellows, all these other politicians on earth, he's going to be more determined, more stout, more succeeding, more pushy, more stubborn. And therefore, his look was more stout than his fellows, and I beheld, and the same horn made war with the saints and prevailed against them, until the Ancient of Days came. We were looking at Jesus there, and judgment was given to the saints of the Most High, and the time came that the saints possessed the kingdom, looking at the second coming of Jesus Christ there. And this stubborn little pushy man pushing the whole world around, more stout than his fellows. And I beheld, and the same horn made war with the saints and prevailed against them until the Ancient of Days came. So clearly the saints are here in these last days when this Antichrist steps on to the world stage. Time and time it comes up in Daniel chapter 7. Here it is again. And he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand until a time 1 year, and times 2 years, that makes 3 years, and the dividing of time half a year. So for how long? 3.5 years of great tribulation. This little horn, more stout than his fellows, where's he standing up? Rome morphs into Rome in this same sense, coming back. Well, interesting when you look at some of the history. You don't have to be a great historian to look at the history of Rome. You had Rome in Italy, you had Rome in, which is now called Istanbul. Constantine sets up Rome in Constantinople. He's had kind of a Roman Empire of sorts in Italy, and then the Roman Empire goes over into Constantinople, which is now Istanbul. So you're looking at Turkey. And when Rome fell there, they had the view that Moscow and Russia was going to be the third Rome. So you think to yourself, wow, you can see how Rome has kind of morphed and moved around from Italy to what's now called Istanbul, which was once called Constantinople, which was named such after Constantine, who had the view that they were the new Rome in Istanbul, which is now called Istanbul. And when that fell to the Muslims, you read that the Christians were going over to Russia and Moscow, and viewing them as being the third Rome. So you can kind of see how Rome could so easily come back in this respect. And in these prophecies here of Daniel, it points to 10 kings that will eventually stand up as coming out of the Roman Empire, so to speak. And these aligning, in fact, in the book of Revelation, talks of these 10 kings that stand up in the last days, which in the same sense came out of the old Roman Empire, in the same sense wanting to bring the Roman Empire back. In this same sense, they will have one mind with the beast. These have one mind with the beast, and shall hate the whore, and shall eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. Well, who is the whore? The capitalistic, mammon worship, money worshipping capitalistic West. Well, if you're over there in the Middle East and you're like Daniel and he's prophesying, or like Ezekiel, as prophesying with the view of his own country in mind, his own land in mind, or even Babylon in mind, where Daniel was at the time, and Daniel got a lot of these prophecies. You're looking at Iraq now as something to do with which was once Babylon. So again, you're still looking north. There's a lot of prophecies about this king coming up out of the north and being much like Rome, which you might call again the new Rome. In this sense, Constantine sets up what he called the new Rome. It wasn't in Italy, it was over there in the east, in Istanbul. And when that fell to the Muslims, you read history, you read that a lot of the Christians there were going over to Moscow in order to set up Moscow as being the third Rome. And indeed, you go on to read how these various leaders that stood up in Russia called themselves czars, and this is short for Caesars, because they wanted to mould and shape themselves as being the new Rome. This was the kind of thinking they had. And this is the history you look at. Well, there's a lot of history, and it depends on which history books you're reading. If you're reading history as coming at this from a spiritual perspective, then you look into Bible history. Well, it depends on what country you're in and how you view history and what history books you read. Then you get a various view, a different view from each country, depends upon what their bias is and what they've got in mind. And so you get these various histories, and a lot of these leaders in the world today are coming from history. How far back do you go in history, where you had the land of Israel set up in the last days here? And they're coming from a history. Their history stems right back even to Adam and Eve. Well, so how far back in history do you go to justify some invasion of some country, or some view that such a country was once your country, and all you're doing is taking it back? And you're a man of war, you're a man of peace. You want peace, but they want war. You choose to go to war because you want peace and they want war. So are you a man of peace, or are you a man of war? If you're a man of peace and others are making war with you, and then you have to go to war with them, then you could still view yourself as a man of peace, but they want war. This is the kind of mentality you picture the Antichrist having, or at least putting out this view. So there's various ways you can come at all of this, and the most safest thing you could ever do, yes, perhaps look at history, because you can see how this could happen when you look at history. We don't study history, we're in danger of reliving it, but if you look at history, you can get a good idea of how things can possibly play out. You might speculate, as so many people have in the past. There's been many speculating, looking at events in the world and wondering if this is going to lead to this or that's going to lead to that. Well, whichever way you look at it, the safest thing you can do is go to the scriptures, and in the scriptures it has the definite view that Rome is going to come back in a dictatorial sense. You have the prophecies in Daniel chapter 2, you're down into the feet of Daniel chapter 2. If you understand anything about Daniel chapter 2, there's various kingdoms shown as being pictured as being an image of a man, an image of a monstrous looking man, so to speak, with a head of gold, arms of silver, belly and thighs of brass, and legs of iron. And these legs of iron are Rome indeed, and this iron stems off into the last days as being part of the feet, and the feet there pictured as being part iron and part clay, so part dictatorship and part democracies in the last days. So you get these dictatorships and democracies in the last days, very much a feature of the last days. And then again, you have Jesus coming back. So in other words, you have dictatorial kingdoms in the last days, and you have so-called democratic clay-like kingdoms, so-called voting, and people vote for their various leaders. But a lot of this, all of this becomes mingled in the last days, in that you're going to have dictatorships and democracies in the last days. And so again, you have this view that the world's going to be split into two. So when you see the world split into two, as it is now, with the view that Rome in this same sense is coming back, the dictatorial iron-fisted iron being the dictatorial kingdoms, and these smashing and breaking the clay, as is brought out in Daniel chapter 2. And these various chapters talk again of two kingdoms in the last days, finally reigning somewhat supreme until Jesus returns. And so you have this view of Rome coming back in this sense, where you can see that how that could happen if you look at some sort of history of Rome and how they have the view over there in Russia, no doubt to this day that Moscow is going to be the third Rome. Well, whether that'll play out that way or not, the Bible does view this king of the north, king of the south scenario, and the king of the north being dictatorship, dictatorial kingdom like the iron, if not the iron itself, as prophesied in Daniel chapter 2. So these various prophecies have all played out in the last days, and indeed, in this same sense, Rome, the dictatorial, iron-fisted, autocratic rule of Rome, is in this sense coming back. And this is brought out in Daniel chapter 7. Well, in Daniel chapter 8, it gives you some more history, and it even names the countries that come in prior to Rome. And therefore, in Daniel chapter 8, you have, let's go for chapter 8, verse 8. You have this he-goat that Daniel again sees in a vision. This angel that keeps visiting Daniel, not annoying him, not pestering him, but coming into Daniel's mind, or coming into his thoughts, or coming into his very room, or coming and standing upon rivers and so on. Either way, or this angel would turn up in his dreams and giving him these various visions, and coming at this end time prophecies from various different angles, where another angle was what you read in Daniel chapter 8, where Daniel was shown a vision of a he-goat. And this he-goat, again, is indeed Greece. Well, Greece then, what happened after Greece? You had Rome. Well, this deals with Greece. So clearly you had these prophecies being given to Daniel. You had Babylon, you had Media-Persia, and then you had Greece, Median-Persian being a dual empire, followed by Greece. All of this is brought out in Daniel chapter 7. It's also brought out in Daniel chapter 8. And so you have this he-goat, which is indeed Alexander the Great. So verse 8, Daniel chapter 8, verse 8, therefore the he-goat. Now this is a prophecy about Alexander the Great. Well, you picture these, you think, well, how did we all end up with an Antichrist? How did we all end up with the Antichrist world empire being much like Rome? How did we end up with these various leaders that are going, and particularly the Antichrist that's going to stand up in the last days? And somehow or other, history played a part in all of this. depending upon how these various leaders view their various histories, and then how they felt there was wrongs in the past that needed to be put right. And so these various kings would stand up and right the wrongs of the world, and eventually the Antichrist would stand up and apparently right all wrongs and bring in a great world empire. Well, here's the kind of history that the Bible gives as to where all of this is coming from and where it's going. And so it gives some history of, you've got Alexander the Great here. So we're in verse 8, chapter 8. Therefore the he-go. Now this is Alexander the Great in a prophecy given to Daniel. And indeed all this came true. It says, when these things come to pass, when this comes to pass, right, lo, it will come. Then shall they know that a prophet had been amongst them. Well, all of these prophecies given to either Daniel or Ezekiel, all come to pass. In the past, they've all come to pass. Lo, when this comes to pass, lo, it will come. When this cometh to pass, lo, it will come. Then shall they know that a prophet had been amongst them. Well, the prophecies in Daniel have all come to pass. Lo, they have come, and lo, they will come. When this come to pass, lo, it will come. Then shall they know that a prophet had been amongst them. So we go with the prophets whose prophecies have indeed come true. Well, Daniel prophesied that Media-Persia would come, dual empire, indeed it did. And Media-Persia is in fact named in these prophecies of Daniel as being the dual empire that followed Babylon. And when Daniel saw an he-go in Daniel chapter 8, here we are, and he's shown this he-go as being Alexander the Great. Well, indeed it came to pass. Greece indeed followed Media-Persia. All of this is brought out. The ram, there was a ram that Daniel saw in the same chapter 8. The ram which thou sawest having two horns are the kings of Media-Persia. Well, the Media-Persia dual empire is named even in the prophecies of Daniel before they even happened. When this cometh to pass, lo, it will come. Then shall they know, then shall ye know that a prophet have been amongst you. So these prophecies of Daniel have indeed come true. Media-Persia did indeed follow Babylon. And then Greece indeed followed Media-Persia as being the next incoming world empire of its day. So the angel speaking to Daniel in verse 20, the ram which thou sawest having two horns are the kings of Media and Persia, which indeed came true. Verse 21, and the rough go, this is Alexander the Great, is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that's between his eyes is the first king. So this is Alexander the Great. And again you have verse 8, therefore the he-go, this is Alexander the Great coming in after the Medes and Persians. Therefore, the he-go waxed very great, in fact. And when he was strong, the great horn was broken. This is Alexander the Great eventually dies. And for it came up four notable ones toward the four winds. Well, when Alexander the Great died, you only got to look at history. People, of course, have looked at history. And it's well known and well agreed that, and it's historic fact, that the four generals of Alexander the Great took over as from when Alexander the Great died. Well, all of this prophesied in the writings of Daniel, lo, when this come to pass. When this come to pass, lo, it will come. Then shall they know that a prophet had been amongst them. So again, you've got another prophecy coming true here. When Alexander the Great died, his kingdom was split up amongst his four generals. All of this prophesied in the writings of Daniel. And indeed, the track record of Daniel is that all of this come true. So why are not people looking to the prophecies of Daniel to understand what's going on today in the world today? And all of this coming from history and all of these world empires rising and falling. which will eventually give rise to the Antichrist world empire. He, in fact, coming out of the north. Time and time again, these prophecies point to this Antichrist as coming up out of the north. Well, therefore, this is again pointing to some sort of history whereby the Antichrist will eventually come out of the north. And the history of the Antichrist, in a lot of ways, stems right back even to the time period of Alexander the Great. This is the historic facts that the Bible gives itself. Therefore, the he-goat waxed very great. We're going way back now to Alexander the Great and Greece. And when he was strong, the great horn was broken. And for it came up 4 notable ones toward the 4 winds of heaven. This is his 4 generals. And out of one of them came forth a little horn. So out of one of these these kingdoms, when Alexander the Great died, his kingdom is split up amongst his 4 generals. So out of one of these comes forth this little horn. In fact, you can picture the world split up into, of its day, this great world empire of Alexander the Great. The great world empire split up amongst his 4 generals. You have 1 general in the north, 1 in the south, 1 in the east, 1 in the west. Well, it's the one in the north that reigned more supreme, though these various wars would break out between the king of the north and king of the south. Well, these prophecies point to the Antichrist, the little horn, as coming out of the northern regions of the breakup of Alexander the Great's kingdom. So you're in Israel and you're looking north, and so somewhere in the northern regions as north from Israel, these prophecies given to God's children of that day, pointing to the rise of an Antichrist in our day, and pointing to this Antichrist as coming up out of the north. So, and out of one of them, these 4 generals and their different slicing up the world amongst between all 4 of them, king of the north, king of the south, and king of the east, king of the west. Well, you had the king of the north, king of the south, these 2 reigning more supreme than the rest of these constant wars breaking out between the king of the north, king of the south. And out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great. Now this is the Antichrist, you've got the little horn again. And out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great toward the south. Well, where is he? He's waxing great because he's in the north. He's waxing great towards the south, and towards the east, and towards the pleasant land. Now, the pleasant land here is Jerusalem, is Israel. The pleasant land was always Israel to Bible believers. So, of course, this concerning the history of God's people. And therefore, this little horn waxes great towards the south, towards the east, and towards the pleasant land. And this again pointing to him being the king of the north. So he's clearly the king of the north time and again. It waxed great even to the host of heaven. The host of heaven here is God's children. And it cast down some of the host of the stars to the ground and stamped upon them. Well, the host of heaven here and the stars that are trampled on here again, God's children in the last days, the Antichrist persecutes God's children and tramples them underfoot. Can't destroy them, but he can persecute them and trample them underfoot, which again points time and time again to the last days. And God's children indeed being here in the last days, because this little horn indeed tramples them underfoot. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, which is, of course, Jesus. And by him the daily sacrifice was taken away. Well, this is the Antichrist going into the temple of God. He sits in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. He opposes all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he, as God, sit in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. You're looking at the last 3.5 years of man's history on earth under the Antichrist here in these verses, pointing time and time again to the saints being here in the last days. Why are we being given these prophecies? Why was Daniel given these prophecies? Daniel died 2,500, 600 years ago. And how come he was given these prophecies so that we would understand what's going on in the last days? How this king would indeed stand up in the north time and time again. It points to this king standing up in the north, waxing strong towards the south, towards the east, even to the pleasant land, being the land of Israel. So, yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host. Well, this is Jesus, the prince of the host, us being the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away. So the religious worship of the Jews, and not only the religious worship of the Jews, but it turns out the religious worship of all faiths. And the place of his sanctuary, this is the temple, God's temple. The people say there's going to be a rebuilt temple. The place of his sanctuary, in other words, the place of God's sanctuary, God's temple. God, what it symbolizes is God's temple. It's supposed to be God's temple, but in fact, Jesus done away with what became temple worship. Jesus done away with this when Jesus was crucified 2,000 years ago now. The church, in fact, is the temple of God, and Jesus is the cornerstone of the true church, being the stones. But the Jews have the view that their Messiah will come and initiate the building of the third temple. And therefore, though this house or this sanctuary built to God's glory will in fact not be, will be built with unbelieving hands, in that the Jews, they rejected their Saviour 2,000 years ago. And if you don't believe that the Messiah has already come in the flesh, which Jesus did, the Word was made flesh, then you are indeed under Antichrist, you're under the spirit of Antichrist. So if you choose to build this third temple as unto God, then it will be viewed of as being an abomination to God. So he's going to take away the daily sacrifice, the religious worship of the Jews, the daily sacrifice, their animal sacrifice outside the newly built temple. And and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary, so-called place of God's dwelling, being the house of God, being the temple, Solomon's temple built to the glory of God. But in the last days, Jesus saying 2,000 years ago, Jesus saying there won't be one stone left upon another that will not be cast down. But so rebuilding the temple with unbelieving hands, this is what was cast down. And an host was given to him against the daily sacrifice. So God, in fact, is against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression. So a newly built temple built with unbelieving hands would not be a temple built to the glory of God, and therefore God not pleased to dwell in that temple, but God more pleased to dwell in the true temple, us being living, lively stones. The true temple of God in the last days would indeed be the Christians. The false and fake temple as built to the glory of the false and fake Messiah will be the temple, and therefore and an host was given to him, given the Antichrist, against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, because they are indeed in transgression in building the temple. And it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. So this Antichrist is going to indeed cast the truth down to the ground, and is going to practice and prosper, is going to practice. In this same sense, he's the son of Lucifer. Therefore, in this same sense, he's practicing witchcraft. In this sense, though, it goes beyond your normal dabbling around with witchcraft. This is indeed the very son of Satan, the son of Lucifer on earth. So all of this brought out, and the ram which thou sawest having two horns, so in verse 20, are the kings of Media Persia, spelling out the history here, and the rough goat is the king of Grecia, so that's Alexander the Great. And the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king, this is Alexander the Great. Now that being broken, when Alexander the Great died, four stood up for it, now that being broken, whereas four stood up for it, four kings, four generals that came out of Alexander the Great's kingdom, four kings shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power, each having their own power, no doubt each wanting to bring back a great world empire. This as powerful as the empire, in fact, of Alexander the Great, but not exactly succeeding in doing so. until we come right into the last days when this king again will stand up. So, and in the latter time of their kingdom, now this prophecy leaps right into the future. Suddenly it leaps right into the future. In the latter time of their kingdom, talking about this king that is going to stand up in the north. Well, no doubt these various generals, these 4 generals that stood up out of Alexander the Great's kingdom when he died, would have dearly loved to bring in another great world empire, much like Alexander the Great did. None of them achieved this until we jump way into the future. And in the latter time of their kingdom, suddenly the prophecy now leaps over Rome, way into the last days. We're way into the last days now, and you have this king, this little horn that's going to stand up in the north that waxes strong, towards the south, towards the east, and even towards the pleasant land, toward the land of Israel. Even taking over the land of Israel, even placing the abomination of desolation in the newly built temple in Jerusalem. And so the prophecy goes on. So, and in the latter time of their kingdom, these 4 generals, don't forget the king of the north reigning supreme, being the stronger of the 4 here. In the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors are come to the full, which they now are, we have a whole world now that's becoming Antichrist. The transgressors are indeed coming to the full. So the world is now ripe for the pickings. The world is now, and largely in this spiritual sense, gone along with the prince of the power of the air. They've thrown in their lot, they've thrown in their vote, they've rejected the gospel, they've rejected the gospel that's been preached in all the world. Now you have their king, when the transgressors are come to the full, which they now have. A king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up. So understanding dark sentences, just like Jesus was in direct communication with God himself, the Son of God on earth, and always looking to the Father. Everything he did and said was coming from and through the Father. This Antichrist man, when he stands up, is going to be exactly the same. When the transgressors are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up. So in other words, everything he says and does is all coming from the devil himself. He understands dark sentences. He worships his father, which is the devil himself. Therefore, in this same sense, he's like the Son of God on earth, but it's the son of Satan on earth. And his power shall be mighty, this mighty king that stands up in the north, but not by his own power. So he's not operating under the arm of his own power now. He's gone and completely over to Satan. He's gone completely over to his father. In this same sense, it's like what Ezekiel said about the Antichrist in the last days. And thus saith the Lord God. We're talking with Ezekiel now, again pointing to this king of the north. Thus saith the Lord God, it shall come to pass that at the same time shall things come into thy mind, and thou shalt think an evil thought. So you're looking at this king standing up in the north. In this same sense, this king suddenly thinking an evil thought. Thus saith the Lord God. It's Ezekiel chapter 38, verse 10. Thus saith the Lord God, it shall come to pass that at that time when the Antichrist stands up and invades Israel from the north in the last days and places this abomination of desolation, just before then, at that time, we're looking at the last 3.5 years of the reign of the Antichrist here, this king that will eventually stand up in the north at that time. Thus saith the Lord God, it shall come to pass at the same time shall things come into thy mind, and thou shalt think an evil thought. Verse 14, therefore, son of man, prophesy, and say unto Gog being the Antichrist here, thus saith the Lord God, in that day when my people of Israel dwelleth safely, that shalt thou not know it. And thou shalt come from thy place out of the north parts. Again, pointing to the north of Israel, Gog, the Antichrist, and Magog, Russia. This Antichrist coming out of Magog, Russia. And thou shalt come from thy place out of the north parts, thou and many people with thee, all of them riding upon horses, a great company and a mighty army. Wow, talking to Ezekiel in those days, of course you're going to speak and talk in a language that he would understand. War back then would have been horses and spears and shields and swords and such. But now we have guns and tanks and planes. Thus saith the Lord God, art thou he of whom I have spoken in old time by my servants the prophets of Israel, which prophesied in those days many years that I bring thee against them, so this king clearly again points to this king standing up in the north, this king of the north that stands up, this king of the north that will think an evil thought. Thus saith the Lord God, it shall come to pass that at the same time, shall things come into thy mind, and thou shalt think an evil thought. This is when the Antichrist, this king that stands up in the north, becomes what you might call fully possessed of Satan himself. So when the transgressors have come to the fall, back in Daniel chapter 8, a king of fierce countenance, he's possessed of Satan, is he not? A king of fierce countenance, understanding dark sentences. Where is sentences coming from? Where are these dark sentences coming from? Not sentences of light, like Jesus was speaking, but sentences of darkness that Satan would speak. This king that stands up in the north, he thinks an evil thought. And now he's possessed. He's in direct communication with Satan himself. And his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. So where's his power coming from? It's coming from the devil himself. He thinks an evil thought. Things have come into his mind, and he thinks an evil thought. And it's at this point that he gets possessed of Satan himself. He thinks an evil thought, and his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. Where's his power coming from? It's not from his own power. It's coming from Satan himself. Satan has now possessed this king that stands up in the north, and he shall destroy wonderfully. He's going to have all this super powerful technology all on his side here now. And he shall destroy wonderfully, and shall prosper and practice. Again, you're looking at witchcraft there, shall prosper and practice, talking again about witchcraft. He's in direct communication with Satan himself. He understands dark sentences. And shall destroy the mighty. He's going to destroy the mighty people. You got the king of the north, king of the south again here. And the holy people invades Israel from the north. And through his policy also he shall cause craft, scientific witchcraft, all of this technology, all of these computers, the prince of darkness, grim, we tremble not for him. His rage we can endure, for lo, his doom is sure. For one little word shall fail him. A mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never fouling. Our helper he amidst the flood of mortal ills prevailing. For still our ancient foe does seek to work us woe. His craft and power are great. And through his policy also he shall cause craft. His craft and power are great. While his craft and power is indeed great in these the last days. Because now we have all of this scientific witchcraft on earth. And through his policy also, he's going to set up this abomination of desolation, is he not? This image of the beast, is he not? He's going to worship this strange God and God of forces, is he not? A strange God whom his fathers knew not. shall he honour with gold, silver, and precious stones. He's going to set up this abomination of desolation. His craft and power indeed great in the last days. A mighty fortress is our God. Yes, in the last days, we're going to need a mighty fortress is our God. A bulwark never failing, our helper, he amidst the flood of mortal ills prevailing. Why? Because we're going to be here when the Antichrist stands up. He's going to make war against the saints. His craft and power are great, and armed with cruel hate. On earth is not his equal. Did we in our own strength confide, our striving would be losing. Were not the right man on our side, the man of God's own choosing. Dost ask who that may be? Christ Jesus, it is he. Lord Sabaoth his name, Lord of a mighty army, Lord Sabaoth his name, from age to age the same, and he must win the battle. Did we in our own strength confide, our striving would be losing. Were not the right man on our side, the man of God's own choosing, being Jesus. So, and through his policy also, he shall cause craft to prosper in his hands, so scientific witchcraft. And he shall magnify himself in his heart, so his self-worship, much like Satan himself. And by peace shall destroy many. He's a man of peace, but he certainly does war. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes. Well, he's clearly the Antichrist. He's standing up against the prince of princes. But he shall be broken without hand. He won't be broken by tanks and guns and planes or even atom bombs. He'll be broken by Jesus Christ himself. And the vision of the evening and the morning which was told is true. Therefore shut thou up the vision, for it shall be for many days, for our days. And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick certain days afterward, and I rose and up and did the king's business. And I was astonished at the vision, but none understood it. But we understood it better now in the last days. Again, you've got reference to this king that stands up in the north, indeed, in Daniel chapter 11. And this goes right into what this king is going to do in the last days, setting up the abomination of desolation, again invading Israel from the north. And this angel bringing all of this to Daniel's attention, again talking about Alexander the Great. And when he shall stand, a mighty, so verse 3, Daniel 11, verse 3, and a mighty king shall stand up and shall rule with great dominion, this is Alexander the Great, and do according to his will. And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken. So Alexander the Great dies again and again. We got talk of Alexander the Great giving us some history of where the Antichrist is largely going to come from. The latter time of their kingdom, these four generals that stand up out of Alexander the Great's kingdom when he dies, in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors are come to the fore, a king of fierce countenance, understanding dark sense is going to stand up in the north. So here we have reference to the north yet again. Standing up in the north of Israel, from the northern parts out of in one of those lands, north of Israel, will indeed stand up the Antichrist. These are the prophecies of Daniel. Lo, when this comes to pass, lo, it will come. Then shall they know that a prophet had been amongst them. Well, all of the prophecies of Daniel indeed come true in the past, so why wouldn't they come true in the future? You're listening to a prophet that gets things right, because the prophet here is listening to God himself, and he's simply writing down everything God says, and therefore everything God says does indeed come true. When this comes to pass, lo, it will come, then shall they know that a prophet had been amongst them. And so he's talking here about Alexander the Great and this king that's going to stand up in the north yet again. And a mighty king shall stand up that shall rule with great dominion. This is Alexander the Great, and do according to his will. And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken. Alexander the Great dies and shall be divided toward the four winds. So again, this tarries in with Daniel chapter 8. These four winds, and not to his posterity, not to his children, nor according to his dominion. Well, they didn't quite rule as powerfully as Alexander the Great, though no doubt they dearly would have loved to become the new great emperor of a new great world empire, and bring back the glory that was once for them, Greece. So the Alexander the Great's kingdom, which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others beside those. So Alexander the Great dies, and his kingdom is passed over down to his 4 generals. And the king of the south shall be strong. Now here's the great battle between the king of the north, king of the south, these two reigning supreme, battling it out. And this really revisited in the last days, in that a king is indeed going to stand up yet again in the north. And the king of the south shall be strong. So this general in the south, who becomes the king of the south, and the king of the north, we're now going to jump into the last days. We're going to leap over Rome. We're going to leap over, well, in fact, in Daniel chapter 11, it gives you some early history of these various kings, so that you can kind of see, really, you can see how all of this stems way back in history, and which will eventually give rise to the king of the north, and no doubt he will preside over history and feel that there are many wrongs in the past that now need to be put right. And so he will become the dominant leading power. And of course, this is Satan trying to set up his kingdom on earth all along, and setting up as coming through and from this king that will stand up in the north, and was setting up a kingdom that will indeed be dictatorial, autocratic, as the same as Rome was, iron-fisted, and will crush every other kingdom on earth and stamp the residue with the feet of it. In other words, stamp its culture on the whole earth, something that Rome tried to do and eventually failed, something that the Antichrist will do and succeed, and eventually fail and fall when Jesus Christ returns to set up his kingdom on earth. And the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes, and he, the king of the north, in other words, shall be strong above him. So the king of the north is stronger than the king of the south, and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. Well, it goes into the various history of these kings of the north and king of the south, and in the end of years they shall join themselves together, for the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north. They even married off their daughters to each other. The king of the south would marry his daughter off to the king of the north, and form an alliance this way. This alliance would go wrong, and then out of the branch of her roots, in other words, out of her family line, another would stand up, and which shall come with an army, and shall enter into the fortresses of the king of the north. So there's various wars breaking out between the king of the north, king of the south, and shall deal against them and shall prevail. Here it even names the king of the south being Egypt, and shall carry away captives into Egypt, their gods, with their princes, and with their precious vessels of silver. So plundering and stealing and taking from the king of the north. In fact, they win the war. What do? They plunder the land and take all this back to Egypt. Egypt here is portrayed as being the king of the south. So you have this king of the north, a king of the south scenario, and so this king, but out of her branches, roots, one stand up in his estate. So standing up in the estate of the former king of the north, which shall come with an army, and shall enter into the fortress of king of the south, in fact, and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north, and shall deal against them, and shall prevail. So this king of the south appears to prevail against the king of the north here, and shall also carry captives into Egypt their gods with their princes and their precious vessels of silver and gold, and he shall continue many more years than the king of the north. So the king of the south reigning supreme here, and the king of the north now losing in this war. But does this stop? The king of the north comes back. So the king of the south shall come into his kingdom, and shall return to his own land, but his sons shall stir up and shall assemble a great. So here's the king of the great forces, and one shall certainly come and overflow and pass through. Then shall he return and be stirred up even to his fortress. Well, the way it's written might be hard to follow, but you basically get the gist of all of this, that there's these great battles that between the king of the north, king of the south. And the king of the south shall be moved with choler, and shall come forth and fight with him, even with the king of the north. So you have these constant battles between the king of the north, king of the south, going on. then this same prophecy leaps way into the future. So you get the gist of it there with this king of the north, king of the south, these two generals that came out of Alexander the Great's kingdom, how they battle it out a time and again, 1 minute, at one time, 1 year to say 1 minute, at one time the king of the north will be winning. And then the king of the south will come back and he would be winning and becoming the leading power and so on. So, for the king of the north shall return and shall set forth a greater multitude than the former, and shall certainly come after certain years and with a great army and with much riches. And so on it goes in those, and so then suddenly, this is the thing, then suddenly at the latter time of their kingdom, at the latter time of these great wars that break out, in other words, between the king of the north, king of the south, the latter time of their kingdom, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up. This is again brought out in Daniel chapter 11. You have these various wars between the king of the north, king of the south, until finally in the latter time of their kingdom, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up, as prophesied in Daniel chapter 8. Suddenly you get a glimpse way into the future again. This prophecy leaps way into the future yet again, suddenly jumping into Daniel 11 verse 21, and his estate. In other words, in the estate, in the former place of the former king of the north, suddenly we're now leaping into the future. In the latter time of their kingdom, in the latter time since the time when Alexander the Great died, and these four generals stood up in his place. The king of the north, king of the south, having these various wars. In the latter time of their kingdom, suddenly this little horn stands up. Here he is in verse 21, and in his estate, in the power of the former king in the latter times now, and in his estate shall stand up a vile person. Now here's this king of the north again, this Antichrist, this vile person. And here it talks of him coming to power in the north, how he comes to power in the north. This is how it reads. And in his estate shall stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give the honour of the kingdom. They don't appear to accept this king at first. But he shall come in peaceably. He sees himself as a man that's trying to bring peace. So the Antichrist indeed sets himself up as a man of peace. He's a man of peace. The problem is they all want war. This is the picture it paints. And in his estate shall stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give the honour of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably. So he's coming in with all of these peace proposals, and I guess it turns out that all they want is war against him. Well, this is the picture it paints. And obtains the kingdom by flattery, but he shall come in peaceably. And obtain the kingdom by flattery. So he flatters people. He no doubt flatters the people of the kingdom of the king of the north. He no doubt flatters other leaders that align and join with him. He has men's persons in admiration because of the advantage. So by flattering them and making them feel really powerful and good about themselves, in aligning with him, they indeed align themselves with this king that stands up in the north. And with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him. So he's no doubt a man of muscle and might. He's no doubt a man of military muscle and might. And though he portrays himself as a peaceful man who wants peace, a peace broker, he knows he has to do war. So you've got a kind of the tactics here of the Antichrist. He's a man of peace. He flatters people to get his way with them. He comes in peaceably. He can also do war if he has to. So with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him and shall be broken. Now identifies him as being the prince, yea, also the prince of the covenant. This is him. This is the prince of the covenant. This is the one that it talked about in Daniel chapter 9, the prince of the covenant. The one who brokers a deal between the Jews and the religious worship of all faiths. and sets up this covenant in the last days, this holy covenant. Yea, also he's the prince of the covenant, the one that was talked about in Daniel chapter 9, who's called the prince of the covenant. And it simply spells this out here. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of, in other words, for 7 years. And in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease. So there you have the religious worship of all faiths to cease, and particularly talking here about the religious worship of the Jews. This will cease when the Antichrist invades Israel from the north and places the abomination of desolation. This Antichrist here in Daniel chapter 9, called the Prince of the Covenant. So the prince shall be, so it talks there about the prince of the covenant, and he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. In other words, 7 years. It's an old Jewish word. The word for week was Shabuah. This is simply 7 years. And in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease. In other words, the religious worship of all faiths. And for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, make desolate the worship of the one true God, even until the consummation, even unto the end of this 7 years. So he breaks the covenant in the midst of the week, in other words, places the abomination of desolation, exalts and opposes himself above all that is called God and that is worshipped, so that he as God sit in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. So all of this fulfilled in, again, this king of the north standing up, a vile person to whom they shall not give the honour of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. And with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him and shall be broken. So in other words, he sets himself up as a man of peace, but with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him and shall be broken. So he can also do war, and eventually he overtakes and rises to power in the north through both peace and war with the arms of a flood. So they be overflown from before him and shall be broken. And after the league made with him, these various kingdoms in the north, he takes over. And after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully, he shall come up and shall become strong with a small people. He shall enter peaceably, even upon the fattest places of the province in the north. And he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He shall scatter among them the prey, the spoil, and the riches. And he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds, even for a time. So in other words, he's like a modern day Robin Hood that sets himself up as a great peaceful man, but he realises he has to do war to achieve his goals. He takes over the fattest places of the province and shares all this amongst the people. In other words, taking from the rich and giving to the poor, and so becomes a great hero in the eyes of the people, him winning these various wars in the north and taking over even the fattest places of the province of the north. So he's coming to power in the north, and he shall stir, once he gets to great power in the north, he shall stir up his power and courage against the king of the south. So first, this king comes to power in the north, and then he stirs up his power, and he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. So once this great king stands up in the north and destroys the mighty and even the holy people, it goes on to say, he gets to a stage when he feels he's so great and so powerful and so strong that he now declares war on the south. So it pictures this king that stands up in the north as first coming to power in the north. He comes in through flattery. He comes in peaceably. He obtains the kingdom by flatteries. He flatters and makes other people feel really good about themselves. He has men's persons in admiration because of advantage. But all along, he's a vile person, and he's the very Antichrist. Yea, also it says. Yea, also the prince of the verse 22, with the arms of a flood, he eventually comes to power through war. And with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him, and shall be broken. Yea, also, this is him. This, again, is the Prince of the Covenant. This is pointing to this king of the north, which will indeed stand up in the north. This king that will stand up and set himself up as a great peaceful man who's come to bring peace to the world. But he feels he has to bring peace to the world with the arms of a flood. So with the arms of a flood shall they be overflowed from before him and shall be broken. Yea, also he's the Prince of the Covenant. So he comes to power in the north, and once he becomes so powerful in the north, he then declares war on the south, and he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south. So here he is declaring his courage and his power against the king of the south. When he becomes powerful in the north, and he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. Here we are, great armies all over again. These generals, this general in the north, general in the south, amassing their great armies against each other. This king of the north that stands up in the last days, this vile person to they do not give the honour of the kingdom. He finally gets the honour of the kingdom when he takes over the arms of a flood. He comes in peaceably and even to the fattest places of the province. He scatters amongst them the prey, the spoil, and the riches, which sounds much like communism, taking from the rich and giving to the poor. This is what he portrays to do. And then he becomes so powerful in the north that he declares war on the king of the south. This launching the Antichrist into the seat of power of the whole world. He becoming now the peace broker. Him becoming now the very Prince of the Covenant, the Prince of the Holy Covenant, the Prince that the Jews have long awaited Messiah, who's going to bring peace to the world. This king that stands up in the north, that sets himself up as a peaceful man, that flatters people that can do war with the arms of a flood so they be overflown before him, shall be broken, finally enforces his will upon the whole world in setting himself up as the peace breaker of the whole world, the one that's going to be the Prince of the Holy Covenant, bringing the world into this false and fake peace deal in the last days, the Holy Covenant between the religious worship of all faiths, between the mammon worships, the capitalistic money worship, mammon worship, being faiths, and the man worshipping faith in the north, being the king of the north, communism and capitalism finally shaking hands, this king in the north imposing his will upon the king of the south, and he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army. But he shall not stand, for he shall forecast his devices against him. In other words, this king will win in this great war. And this great war breaks out between this king that stands up in the north, that first comes to power in the north, that with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him in the north, that invades even upon the fattest places the province, that scatters amongst them the prey, the spoil and the rich, as much as communism does. This great king becomes so powerful in the north that he then declares war in the south, and this king of the south loses in this great war. This king of the south, a king of the south shall be stirred up to battle, and with a very great and mighty army. But he shall not stand, for they, the king of the north, shall forecast devices against him. Yea, they that feed the portion of his meat, in other words, the king of the south. There's going to be saboteurs, there's going to be traitors that are going to be working with the king of the north. These indeed, at the top of government in the kingdom of the king of the south, these sabotaging their own countries, and this king of the north will indeed sweep in and take over. He shall take over the mighty and even the holy land eventually. Yea, they that feed the portion of his meat, is king of the south. In other words, you picture these sat round one table. They're all eating from the same table. They're all apparently on the same side. But there are traitors and spies in their midst. And they're working together with the king of the north, taking their plans of the king of the south back to the king of the north. The king of the north know exactly where to strike and how to win this war. And these in the king of the south, traitors, turning on their own people and their own countries and helping bring in this king of the north. Yea, they that feed of the portion of his meat, the king of the south, shall destroy him, shall destroy their own countries, shall destroy the king of the south, and his army, the king of the north, shall overflow. And many shall fall down slain. So in other words, a mighty king is going to stand up. Exactly what it says in Daniel chapter 8. And his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. And he shall destroy wonderfully, and shall prosper and practice, and shall destroy the mighty, being the king of the south, and the holy people. So this king stands up in the north. This is the prince of the covenant. He sets himself up as a man of peace, though he, of course, does war. And here's where it appears the covenant is finally signed, this holy covenant. And both these kings' hearts shall be, so yea, they that feed of the portion of his meat, this king of the south loses in this war, shall destroy him, his saboteurs. And his army, the king of the north, shall overflow, and many shall fall down slain. So this king of the north eventually rises to power through war. He, of course, sets himself up as a great peaceful man, but he feels he has to do war to get into power. So he gets into power, and then he imposes his will upon the whole world. He imposes his will upon the religious world. He imposes his will upon the king of the south. And both these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief. Here they all are sat round one table. And this king of the south is now in submission to the king of the north. And both these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief, and they shall speak lies at one table. So in other words, they're all lying to each other. But it shall not prosper. They're talking peace. But in their hearts there's still war. They're talking peace, the peace of the whole world. This king of the north now imposing his will upon the whole world. He's apparently a man of peace, but in his heart there's still war. He smells a rat. He doesn't trust the king of the south. The king of the south doesn't trust him. They're shaking hands on top of the table. The guns are still out under the table. This is when the Holy Covenant, the ugly old Holy Covenant is signed. An apparent Holy Covenant made with the religious world, with the capitalistic West, Mystery Babylon, mammon worship, money-loving kingdom of the south, and the king of the north. These all shaking hands on the top of the table, but underneath the table the guns are all out. And both these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief. They're really speaking mischief. Well, they say they're speaking peace, but in their minds and in their hearts there's mischief. They're only shaking hands now because they want to get the advantage again later on. This war between the king of the north, king of the south is going to continue indeed. When the Antichrist smells a rat here, and both these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief. And they shall speak lies at one table, which shall not prosper. All this talk of peace of this holy covenant, this holy covenant, this prince of the covenant, this apparent Messiah that they see as being the saviour of the whole world. And this so-called holy covenant that they're all shaking hands now. And it's a religious holy covenant pact, in that they're accepting that this man is the long-awaited Messiah, but there's evil in his heart. There's evil in their heart. They all want the advantage. But it shall not prosper, for yet the end shall be at the time appointed. It's been prophesied when it's going to end. And it's going to end when Jesus returns. Then shall he, so he's imposed his will upon the whole world. He came to power first in the north. He went to war with the king of the south. And now he imposes his will upon the whole world, and he smells a rat. Then shall he return to his land. So he's going back north. He's going to return to his own land. Then shall he return to his land with great riches. He gets a lot out of this holy covenant. He's got the whole world now in the palm of his hands. He's got the king of the south. He's got the capitalistic, democratic, so-called democratic West in his hands. He's an autocratic, dictatorial ruler. He's much like an emperor of Rome. He's kind of set up the third Rome, you might even say. He's now the emperor of Rome. He's now the Tsar. In other words, the Caesar, the great emperor of the great empire. In fact, he's got the whole world in the palm of his hands. He's got the king of the south who's lost in this great war. All of these saboteurs conspiring against their own governments, working together with the Antichrist in bringing this Antichrist in. Arms of a flood are all on his side, and he's got the greater and better weapons. He's brought them into submission to him. Then shall he return to his land with great riches. He's got the whole world now. And his heart shall be against the holy covenant, this solely called holy covenant. When all of the religions of the world shake hands with the Jews, shakes hands with the Muslim, and the Muslim shakes hands with the Christian, and the Christian shakes hands with the capitalist, and the capitalist shakes hands with the communists. The whole world now has gone into this said holy covenant. They're all shaking hands on the top of the table, the religious world, the Christian world, the Muslim world, the Jewish world, the capitalistic money, mammon worshipping world, the communist world. They've all made peace with each other. They've all so-called submitted to the will of this Antichrist, this prince of the covenant. The long-awaited Jewish Messiah is now ruling in the world and setting up Israel and Jerusalem as being the capital of the whole world. And the Jews have now rebuilt their third temple. The Messiah has finally come and he's initiated the building of the third temple. Wow, all of this looking great and the whole world dancing and everything's merry and bright. And everyone's compromising with all of this. There's a great falling away first, as it says. And then suddenly he shall return to his land with great riches, but his heart shall be against the holy covenant. And he shall do exploits and return to his own land. So he shows off and brags. He's now king of the castle. He's now leader of the whole world. He flexes his military muscle and might to the world and exalts himself in their eyes and does all of these great exploits. Then it says, at the time appointed he shall return and come toward the south. But it shall not be as the former or the latter or this peace that was once in the air. He could smell a rat. There's now war in the air. He can smell a rat. For the ships of Chittim, these ships that come out of Cyprus, they're all part of the kingdom of the king of the south, shall come against him. War is back in the air. Therefore he shall be grieved and return and have the indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. There's many against this holy covenant. They say they're all for peace, but underneath the guns are all out, the conspiracies are all out, and there are many turning and taking sides here. And many are going to go over to the Antichrist. For the ships of Chittim, in other words, British warships from Cyprus shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return and have indignation, returning back to the north. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. So here it is, war's back in the air. And what's he going to do? He's going to invade Israel from the north. This is what Jesus said. When ye shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, let him that readeth understand. So look into the prophecies of Daniel and you'll get an understanding of what this all means.